Hi friends, I hope you're having a great day. If you're new here, welcome. My name's Emma Carrington. If you're not new here, welcome back. If you are interested in true crime and justice, you are in the right place. So I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button because we'd love to have you join our little fam here. By way of disclaimer, we discuss true crime cases involving domestic abuse and domestic homicide on this channel. So if that's not the kind of content you are looking for, I completely understand. Take care of yourself and thanks for stopping by. But if true crime is what you're here for, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Today's case is that of David Edwards, and this case was suggested by Liverbird XOXO. So thank you for letting me know what you'd like me to cover. If any of you do have a case request, please drop it in the comments, or you can find my email in the description or show notes. I would love to know if there are any cases that you would like me to have a look at. I personally have a ream of them. Domestic violence and domestic homicide cases are unfortunately way too prevalent, so there's no shortage. But if there's one in particular that you'd like me to have a look into, please let me know. And back to today's case. David Edwards was a well-respected and successful criminal defense attorney. He's said to have been a happy and very sociable man. His friends have said he was funny and a real gentleman. He loved his football and was extremely passionate about his job. David met his partner Debbie on a night out at a local pub and they hit it off straight away. Debbie says David had a great personality. He was lighthearted and easy to get along with. The couple's relationship developed quickly, and it wasn't long before Debbie found out that she was pregnant with David's child. David was thrilled by the news and so excited to be a dad. He was by Debbie's side the whole pregnancy. He went to all the prenatal appointments and he doted on Debbie. He pampered her in any way he could. He cooked for her and just tried to make her life as easy and comfortable as possible. When Debbie gave birth to their little girl, David was besotted. Debbie says that when he held their daughter Mahalia for the first time, he had tears rolling down his face. He was just so happy. He spent any time that he was not at work doing all that he could for his baby girl. He changed nappies, he took his turns at midnight feeds, he bathed her, snuggled her, did all those things that daddies should. This couple seemed to have it all. David was the doting partner and father, and Debbie was just as enamored with David. She was in awe of him. She says that she would often go to the courthouse just to watch him work. She thought he was amazing and she loved to watch him work. She was just so proud of him. Unfortunately, when the couple's daughter was around 5, they began to drift apart. They decided to take a step away from the relationship, and even though they had separated, they remained really good friends and co-parented their daughter well. Debbie even says of this time that she would still cook meals for David and at times do his laundry. Debbie says that they had even discussed reuniting. However, this was not to be. After having been separated from Debbie for about 7 months, David had begun seeing someone new. David began seeing 41-year-old Sharon Manser in May or June of 2014, when he was about 50 years old. He'd previously met Sharon in the year 2000 when he defended her partner at the time in a domestic assault case against her and won. Yeah, you heard that right. So she was claiming that the partner had assaulted her, and David proved in court that that was not the case. So when David came across her profile on Facebook 14 years later, he sent a friend request, and the two chatted online for about a month before agreeing to meet up for a drink. Their new romance was a whirlwind, and in no time at all, Sharon had moved into David's Lancashire home. Debbie says very early in this relationship with Sharon that David ended up with a broken collarbone, and when she asked what had happened, he told her that he'd fallen down some stairs, and Debbie had no reason to not believe him at the time. David and Debbie co-parenting a child meant that Debbie would, of course, come to meet Sharon at some point. And, well, the long and the short of it, Sharon did not make a very good first impression on Debbie. Debbie was working and had arranged for David to take their daughter to a party, but Sharon and David had been drinking heavily all day. And when Debbie called David to remind him of this arrangement, she realised just how drunk the pair were and stated that they were not going to be taking Mahalia anywhere. When Debbie got home from work, Sharon wound up on her doorstep, pounding on the front door, trying to get Mahalia out of the house. Debbie ended up in an argument with this woman, who she'd never met before, just because she was standing her ground, telling her that they wouldn't be taking her daughter anywhere in the state that they were in. Unsurprisingly, Debbie took an instant dislike to the woman, but she knew that David was a good dad and wanted her daughter to continue to have a close relationship with him. So she made no changes to the shared custody arrangements that they had in place. As time went on, Debbie noticed that each time David came to pick his daughter up, he seemed to have black eyes or other bruises or a busted lip and scratches. Whenever Debbie would ask him what had happened, David would shrug it off, saying he'd walked into a door or that he'd fallen. Debbie started to get really concerned for him. David's friends were concerned too, and dubious about the responses he was giving regarding these injuries. One of his mates asked him what had happened when he saw him with scratches on his face one day, and David said he'd been scratched by a cat. But when his friend pointed out worriedly that his ear was bleeding and that his glasses were all twisted, David then said that he'd fallen. None of this sat right with his friend, and the injuries just seemed to keep coming, as did the shaky excuses. Over time, Debbie noticed a change in David. Where he was once bubbly and chatty when he would come to get their daughter for visits, now he seemed withdrawn and quiet, not the confident man that she'd always known. His physical appearance was changing also. He was unkempt and he seemed to be losing a lot of weight. On Father's Day, David called Debbie and told her that he couldn't have their daughter, which upset Debbie. She went to his house to speak with him, and when she saw David, she was shocked. He had 2 black eyes, deep scratches on his face, and red finger-shaped marks around his throat. Debbie says that he was visibly trembling, and it was then she realised that David had not wanted his daughter to see him like this. All of that, we know. Red flags, right? Can we, physical? I have no words. Breathe. Debbie asked him what had happened and if Sharon had done this to him. He told her no, that he had fallen. He did begin to confide in some work colleagues about how he'd received some of these injuries. He told one friend how he came to have a large gash across his nose. He explained that Sharon had hit him with the phone. He also told them of times that she'd thrown ashtrays at him and even a glass coffee table. Even though he seemed to be opening up to those around him, David couldn't bring himself to press charges or leave Sharon. David's colleagues weren't only hearing about Sharon secondhand from David, they also had plenty of chances to see her in action for themselves. She would often turn up to his office and demand to see him, and when his assistant informed her that David was in court or with a client, Sharon would turn her rage on the poor, unassuming woman manning the front desk. She would also harass the firm by phone, calling David constantly, and his colleagues would often hear her screaming through the phone at him. His friends and colleagues urged him to leave Sharon. However, Sharon was not about to let her prize go. She enjoyed living in David's large home, and many people have said that she loved the idea of being with an attorney. And David was a partner at his firm at that. She believed that it gave her prestige, like she contributed to his success. But it was not only physical violence that David was suffering through. Sharon was verbally and emotionally abusive as well. She was absolutely breaking this poor man down. She called him stupid and belittled him constantly. It didn't matter who was around. A year after this relationship had begun, in June of 2015, Sharon and David travelled to Las Vegas to get married. When David told Debbie of his plan to marry Sharon, she was really concerned. She tried to talk to him and expressed her worry that she feared the trouble and violence in the relationship would only get worse once the pair were married. Debbie wasn't the only one trying to reason with David. One of his friends spoke with him before the marriage, and David told him that he really didn't want to get married, but if he didn't, Sharon would kill him. His friend says, quote, "Who does she think she is? I'll go and talk to her." And David was immediately fearful, saying, "No, don't tell her I told you." David also allegedly told friends that Sharon was a nightmare and that she was bleeding him dry. To say that this union was ill-fated would be an understatement. The couple were apparently arguing all the way to the jewelry store when they were going to get Sharon's engagement ring. However, in a 10-minute ceremony in the Little White Wedding Chapel in Las Vegas, with no friends or family present, no one, just the two of them, the two were wed. The photos from the ceremony show David, a stooped and skinny version of his former self from only a year before. This woman certainly worked fast. The photos also showed that David had a bruise beside his eye that Sharon had attempted to cover with makeup. Sharon explained this away, saying that David had banged his eye with the phone receiver the night before while trying to order room service. Hands up who believes her. No? Me either. David also came home from their nuptials with a split lip. This woman, seriously. When they returned home from their wedding, Debbie's predictions and fears were proved correct. Sharon only got more controlling, to the point that she decided who David could see or speak to, and this included Debbie. If Debbie wanted to speak to David, she had to go through Sharon to do it. Debbie very rarely saw David anymore, but on the off chance that they did come into contact, Sharon was stuck to his side, and she was the one who did all the talking. David had no autonomy. He had no free will at this point. Sharon was in full control. He was continuing to lose weight, and he now stooped to take up less space, and he was unable to look people in the eye. He was so far from the confident and commanding attorney that Debbie had known and loved. It broke Debbie's heart to see this fun-loving man be reduced to a shell. His friends and colleagues were still trying to counsel him into leaving Sharon, but he seemed to be beyond reach. The formerly passionate solicitor was now often absent or coming in late in a disheveled state and smelling of alcohol. Now, before Sharon, David had always had a very lively social life and he enjoyed a drink, but it had never affected his work before now. He started letting his clients down, which was not at all like David. Eventually, the firm changed hands and David was made redundant. This capable and kind man who had practiced law for 26 years, who had been a partner in a respected local firm and who spoke 3 different languages, had been broken down by this woman in the space of a year, to the point of losing the position and reputation he'd worked his entire professional life for. Then, to add insult to injury, Sharon blamed him for this. David wasn't able to go to work half the time because of the injuries that she inflicted, and his colleagues were not believing any of his explanations. And when he was at work, she would be calling or coming in to abuse his assistant. But once he was put off, she started berating him for the fact that he was no longer employed. This woman is a nightmare. Debbie went to see David about a month after he and Sharon were married and found him with a cut across his nose. He was trembling and just a physical and emotional mess. Debbie put her foot down. She decided that she had to keep her daughter out of the toxic environment that her father's home had become. So Debbie told David that Mahalia would no longer be coming to their home. If he wanted to see his daughter, he was most welcome to come around on his own to visit her, or they could meet in a neutral place, but she wouldn't be coming back to his house. What a hard and absolutely heartbreaking decision to have to make. knowing that David was such a good dad without this influence in his life, and what her daughter would be missing out on. And on the other hand, poor David, I'm sure he was well aware that there was no way that Sharon would ever agree to him going to Debbie's house or meeting up with her for any reason. It's just devastating all around. It wasn't until 2 weeks after this exchange that Debbie heard from David. He called her and she could hear the heartbreak in his voice as he told her how much he missed Mahalia. He went on to tell Debbie that he was living in hell. He was living every day in fear in his own home. Debbie told him that he needed to get out, that he needed to leave Sharon, because if he didn't, she was going to end up killing him. This, unfortunately, was the last conversation that Debbie ever had with David. On the 22nd of August, after returning from a trip to Spain, Sharon hit the bottle shop to grab a few bottles of wine. 4 bottles of wine. Witnesses, the shop attendant and other customers, saw the couple in a verbal altercation. Sharon was going off at David to the point where other customers tried to intervene to get her to calm down. I'm guessing to no avail. Later that evening, Sharon's 19-year-old daughter found David in the bathroom bleeding. He had a stab wound to his chest and one to his knee. When she confronted her mother, Sharon told her that she didn't mean to hurt him. Really? How do you stab a person twice and claim that you don't mean to hurt them? After this, Sharon decided it was a good idea for the couple to head to the pub, and other patrons are quoted as saying that Sharon was drunkenly and callously unconcerned about her still bleeding husband's welfare. It said that there was blood on his t-shirt and shorts and around his leg. There was a cut to his head with blood coming down his neck. The patrons of the pub were not the only ones to notice Sharon that evening. While the couple were outside on the footpath having a cigarette, a passing patrol officer stopped to speak to the couple because Sharon was screaming at David. There's really no way to adequately describe or explain this interaction, so I will try to put the body cam footage in here. I hope that it doesn't get flagged as copyright, but yeah, I'll attempt to put the recording in here because this woman's just off her head.
What's going on? Hi. Yeah, what's happening? Because I've just come round that roundabout and seen you ragging him around. You're going to tell me what's happening?
We're drunk.
Yeah. Come take a seat in the back of my car and get somebody else to come and speak to your partner.
I don't think so.
I do. I'm not asking.
Will you listen to the local?
Oh, David. Seriously. Solicitor or no solicitor?
Right.
Touch me! Don't you dare touch me!
Don't you go back down
Don't
there.
you dare touch me!
Sit down. Okay.
No, she touched me.
Yes, and I'll touch it again unless you shut up and calm down. I will arrest you.
Please.
Okay.
Shut up. Where?
Take 3 lift home.
What do you think?
3 lift home.
Idiot. Come on, 3 lift home. Move. I swear, David, when I wake up tomorrow, I don't know what mood I'm going to be in.
There you go, Sharon.
Thank you,
Not a
officer.
problem.
Oh, why have you been so nice?
Because you've been nice to me, haven't you?
I'm so nice. Well, when I say killing, I'm not literally killing.
So this vile and aggressive human being cuts David down, demeans him and threatens his life a number of times in front of these police officers, and they just drive them home and wave them on their way. It's just so sad to listen to how she is speaking to him, not to mention the fact that he's still bleeding from her earlier attack. Also, when she comes back to tell him that they're getting a lift home and calls David an idiot, it looks as if the police officer standing beside him is laughing at her antics while she's talking down to him, which is just so disturbing. She's filth. The following morning, Sharon runs into the street calling out for help. An ambulance was called and the first responders found the scene to be quite suspicious. Sharon had also disclosed that the couple had been arguing and that there'd been a knife involved. So paramedics called for the police and Sharon was taken in for questioning. She kept saying she wanted to speak to her husband, insisting that he wasn't dead. The police questioned her and asked what had happened. She claimed that the couple had argued about a tax issue and that David had grabbed a knife. She then said that she'd taken the knife from David and he had, quote, walked into the knife. She then also claimed that he had told her not to call for an ambulance. She then says that she performed a sex act on him and left him in bed to sleep, eventually falling asleep herself on the lounge. She then says that she raised the alarm when she found him when she woke up in the morning, 7 hours later. On inspection of the home, the police found the rather nice home in disarray. There were obvious signs of alcohol abuse, along with blood in the kitchen, as well as on the carpet. The police were not convinced by Sharon's account of the night's events, and they charged her. The physical examination of David's body led investigators to believe that David had been on the receiving end of around 50 to 60 physical injuries to his body at the time of his death. Of these 60-ish injuries, 30 of them were puncture or prod wounds, consistent with a sharp instrument. The police determined that David had been a victim of sustained violence over a period of time, so Sharon was charged with David's murder. She was never released on bail. Sharon continued to deny any culpability in her husband's death. She also denied ever abusing David. But this piece of trash made his family sit through a trial that laid out exactly what everyone had been witnessing and all that poor David had endured throughout this relationship. Debbie sat through the trial so that once her daughter was old enough, she could give her all the facts surrounding her father's passing. Sharon's defense was murky. It ranged from self-defense or an accident to David having done this to himself. However, no one believed that this was the case. The jury was able to hear from David himself. He had inadvertently left a dictaphone running after a meeting, and it captured his side of a phone call he had with Sharon.
We're going to have to refine the excuse for me eye. You know, the garage door that we made up? That doesn't wash, I've just told Chris, and he's not having it. You said to me, I'd like to think that I could punch you and knock you out with a single punch. Well, I've told you do it rather hard, Sharon, don't you?
Over the course of the trial, Sharon claimed that David's injuries were a result of him falling over drunk. But like I said, 60 external injuries, of which 30 were cuts or prod wounds, including stab wounds to his thigh, knee, finger, and a shallow wound to his scalp. It was very unlikely that these were the results of clumsy falls. The Crown Prosecutor, Rob Jansen, said, quote, Sharon Edwards behaved in a domineering and possessive way with her husband and seemed to resent any of his past or even present friends, family, or colleagues. She behaved as though she expected him to devote his entire attention and time to her and made an overbearing nuisance of herself at his work. She had been violent against Mr. Edwards from early in their relationship, but it escalated as time went on. There is no evidence that David ever retaliated physically to her assaults. When he did seek help from professionals for his injuries, she often pretended to genuinely care for him. Other times, she clearly stayed with him to stop him telling people what had really happened. End quote. Prosecutor Anne White, QC, added, the prosecution say that Sharon Edwards was violent towards David Edwards well before his death, and that David Edwards' response to that violence was to tolerate it and not to report it to police, end quote. The jury were then told that David had died from internal bleeding about 4 hours after being stabbed. The stab wound that killed David was 8 centimetres deep into his chest. Evidence encouraging the prosecution's argument that the stab wound was not accidental and not an injury Sharon Edwards could not have been aware of. Quote, I'm going to suggest you knew perfectly well You needed an explanation of why you were holding the knife at the time of your husband's fatal injury. You were thinking of number one, end quote, the prosecutor told her during trial. And after the 2 weeks of Sharon claiming that David had walked into the knife, she was sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years. After hearing that Sharon had 3 previous convictions for domestic violence, including biting and punching an ex-partner, as well as evidence during the case of injuries suffered by Mr. Edwards, the judge continued, quote, "I'm quite sure it wasn't the first time you'd attacked Mr. Edwards. You had, over preceding months, assaulted David Edwards on more than one occasion, and this deadly attack was the culmination of continuous bullying by you," end quote. Unbelievably, a memorial notice, seemingly sent by Sharon from behind bars, was published in the couple's local newspaper a year to the day after his death. This vile human being wrote, quote, "You are missed so much. You're always in my thoughts. You will always be in my heart." This is after she had placed an obituary in the paper just days after David's friends and colleagues held a memorial for him. Again, apparently from behind bars. This read, quote, "Edwards, David Mark, 20th of April, 1964 to the 23rd of August, 2015. Too soon into our married life you've gone. Cherished memories of being together with no idea how I will carry on. All I know, I will be your wife forever. You will always be loved and missed. Love always, your wife, Sharon. Love also from your stepdaughters, Carly and Kelsey. Kiss, kiss, kiss." I have no words. On a nicer note, David's parents, brother and ex-partner Debbie funded a memorial bench at the Chorley football ground. David was an avid supporter of the club and they thought it only fitting to have a memorial at his home away from home. Chorley Football Club commercial manager Josh Vosper said, quote, "For those who didn't know Dave, he was a kind, gentle and often humorous individual who had time for everyone. This bench is a tribute to the man and he'll never be forgotten." So that is where things stand today. Sharon is in prison, obviously where she needs to be. My heart goes out to Debbie and Mahalia. They lost such a great friend and father in all this. I pray for them to find peace despite all of this and for their bond of mother and daughter to be fortified. Please, everybody, let me know what you think about this one, ladies and gents. If you're watching on YouTube, please drop a comment below. Otherwise, you can join me over on Discord where we can have a chat. The Discord link is in the show notes or the description box below. If the content in this case has raised any concerns for you regarding your own relationship or that of a loved one, please reach out for help. There is a list of resources in the show notes and the description box below. My aim in covering these cases is to honour the victims of these crimes and to get their stories out there in the hopes of warning others who may face similar situations. The hope is that the more people who recognise the red flags and warning signs of abusive relationships, the less prevalent these cases will be in the future. I thank you again for joining me today, and until next time, please take care of yourselves and be kind to one another.